This week on the Communicators, the White House Cybersecurity Coordinator Howard Schmidt talks about attempted cyber attacks against the U.S., congressional legislation, and what the administration wants to do better to protect the nation from cyber threats.
Howard Schmidt, what's your responsibilities at the White House?
Yeah, I'm a special assistant to the president and cybersecurity coordinator. And what that means is when we look at the broad issue of security around technology, everything from consumers up to and including nation states, my role as for the president is to coordinate this across the government and make sure we're working with private sector and international partners.
From that perch, how do you view the threat of cyber attack?
Well, it varies from different sectors and it varies to different levels of people. For example, when we look at state versus state, nation states, there's an increasing threat from some countries around the world that basically see this as not only a competitive advantage, but also a military advantage that they're looking to gain. On the other end of the spectrum, we start looking at end users, credit card fraud, identity theft. As we move much of our lives online, that threat continues to grow as well.
So that said, why is a cyber attack or a cyber breach at Sony a national security issue?
A number of things. One, you look at the massive numbers of people that were involved in this. While many people said, well, it was a gaming system and it was just sort of their ability to get in a network, but those same operating systems, that same authentication mechanism, your way to log into systems, are not just Sony's, they're in government systems, they're in financial services. So that's the sort of thing that gets our attention. It says, well, if it can happen with them, it can happen other places as well.
Also joining us here on the Communicators is Gautam Nagesh, who is an editor at Congressional Quarterly. He edits the Technology Executive Briefing.
Thanks, Peter.
Yeah.
Howard, now you referenced the need to address various levels of cybersecurity legislatively, I would assume. The House, right before the recess, passed a package of cybersecurity bills, including one bill known as CISPA, which is aimed at increasing information sharing between the public and private sectors. The White House threatened to veto that bill before it went to the floor. Can you tell us why?
Sure, and let me back up a little bit to what we've submitted last year. When we start looking at all the issues that we've talked about for a long time, from the threats from the end users up to national security issues, we as a government looked at what are the things that we really need the legislative branch to help us with as opposed to things we can do within the executive branch. So we submitted a proposal last May looking at a number of things, including enhanced criminal penalties for interfering with critical infrastructure, looking at things around organized crime, looking at issues about information sharing, both from the government out, et cetera. And so that was where we started from. And that was based on a lot of work, not only within the government, but also external partners. So when we saw this proposed legislation, we truly support we need the ability to share information. We truly believe that the government has to give some ability for private sector to share not only with the government, with each other, but we can't do that at the expense of privacy, civil liberties, liability about some of the laws that currently exist. And when we saw that after a lot of discussions that wasn't meeting that threshold, we said, listen, our advisors will recommend a veto if that comes forward.
Now, the bill did undergo some amendments before it ultimately passed. Have those amendments addressed those concerns sufficiently, or as an advisor of the president, would you still recommend a veto?
Yes, they have not, and that's the challenge we have. Is some people will say, well, gee, they've made progress, that we're looking for too high of a threshold, and that's not good enough. And when it comes to privacy for American citizens, corporate liability, and the ability to share information, when we look at protecting core critical infrastructure, good enough just isn't enough. We as an administration have to have a higher threshold than that, which is why we continue to say, if you don't take care of the things similar to what we've put in the proposal for the Senate side, that we'll recommend a veto.
You mentioned the Senate bill, actually, and its regulations that would address core critical infrastructure. The House has expressed a great deal of resistance to anything that smacks of a mandate or regulation. Do you believe that it would be possible to get something akin to what was in the White House proposal or the Senate package through the House and into law?
As a nation, I think we have a long history of bipartisanship when it comes to national security issues, particularly national security issues that affect public safety and economic well-being. So I continue to hope and feel confident that we will get the smart people together to say, listen, the small regulatory regime that we're talking about, core critical infrastructure, very narrowly crafted, very much built on international best practices on the things that corporations should and in many cases are doing for their own business purposes. We don't see that being asking too much of anybody. So as a consequence, when we start getting all the people together in a bipartisan, we hope that that need to say fixes one small piece of the legislation front, that I think hopefully they can come together on that.
Now, Mr. Schmidt, in your administration briefing or administrative briefing to the President, or the one you released on April 25th, you say that the following legislative changes are necessary: voluntary government assistance to industry, state, and local governments, voluntary information sharing with industry. Is that what the Senate bill says, though? Voluntary?
Yeah, and we're talking about two different things. We're talking about, in one piece, what the Senate's talking about is core critical infrastructure, not everything that's out there. And we want to make a clear distinction between that. When we're talking about the voluntary piece, there's a lot of other pieces of our infrastructure that are not core critical infrastructure. And we start looking at distinction, particularly in the roles that we have state governments, small, medium-sized businesses that may not fall in that core critical. We need to have their ability to help protect themselves as well. Give you a quick example, if I may. If you look at a natural event, say an ice storm, a tornado, something that takes place, the governor, local elected officials, they have to deal with that. The federal government comes in at some point and helps out, but they have to worry about paying overtime. And in these economic times, if there's something we can prevent in cyber from having a similar situation take place, that's what we care about. At the same token, within those jurisdictions, we have small, medium-sized businesses that if they can't sell their products, if they can't move the goods back and forth, they're impacted as well. So that's the other piece of it when we look about the voluntary sharing to help those as well.
Do you think that companies have a responsibility to report cyber attacks to the federal government, or in the case of the Senate bill, to the Department of Homeland Security?
Yeah, and once again, when we look at core critical infrastructure, absolutely. I don't think any of us as citizens or as government entities want to sort of say, yeah, we hope you're doing the right thing, and if something happens, you may or may not tell us. We need a higher level of assurance than that. I think the citizens deserve it. I think the government, in our role of helping to protect the country, has that role as well.
Leon Panetta, last year, said that we could face a cyber attack that could be the equivalent of Pearl Harbor. Do you agree with that assessment?
Well, and once again, it's really difficult when we start attaching physical events and sort of bringing them into cyberspace. Can we experience some tremendous disruption through cyberspace, whether it's intentional or accidental or even equipment failure? Yes, and that's why we have to get ahead of this to make sure we reduce that risk. Fully understanding that we can never, 100% secure everything, but we can reduce the risk down significantly.
Mr. Schmidt, is it tough to compare the world of cyber to physical events or events that have happened in our past that we want to compare them to so we can get a grasp on what's going on?
It is difficult, and that's one of the challenges we run into all the time, where people will talk at different conflicts in the past and say, how do we compare that to cyber? First and foremost, cyber is inextricably connected in everything that we do. It's used for communications, entertainment, transportation, electrical generation, etc. So there's nothing we can really say that this fits into the same box as everything else. On the other side, if we lose some capabilities, it could affect things that we have direct knowledge of. For example, I mentioned the natural disaster. Electricity goes out, you can't get water, you can't get fuel. We know what that's like in the real world. It doesn't make any difference whether it's a cyber event or a physical event. That's the end result, and that's what we have to protect about.
Next question for Howard Schmidt from Gautam Nagesh.
Thank you. Now, Howard, I want to go back to Peter's question because he mentioned that a Pearl Harbor, digital Pearl Harbor, that's the sort of argument that we've heard on the Hill while just from lawmakers justifying the need for legislation. I asked this question of someone from industry on the show recently, and that is, are we at the place now where a cyber attack from a foreign state actor or a criminal organization could cause catastrophic damage to our economy or significant loss of life?
And you asked that, you asked me the same question?
I'm asking you the same question.
Thanks. Yeah, and the issue is, yes, that potential exists, and that's what we need to make sure we're protecting against. The idea of having an infrastructure out there that owned and operated by literally millions of people, thousands of corporations, and sort of having this inserted within our day-to-day life, disruptions could be very, very bad. Now, once again, I have challenges with associating with a particular event and saying it could be the next digital whatever.
Sure.
But we do recognize that there's significant risk out there. Those risks are growing. While the risks are growing, we're doing a lot to mitigate some of those, sort of a chessboard piece, but I think we can do more, and that's what we're compelled to do.
Now, the problem, not the problem, but the thorny part of this issue is that the very industries that would be regulated under these proposals are mostly lobbying fiercely against this sort of requirement, because obviously it would open up not just the cost of implementation, but potential liability concerns when they are inevitably the target of an attack, which we are told is inevitable. So how would you address those concerns, and where is the common ground? Is there any flexibility? Would incentives substitute for requirements? Where do you think that an agreement can be reached there?
Well, I think when we look at the incentives, we actually have had a significant R&D agenda through the Office of Science Technology Policy that we've helped them work on incentives specifically. I'll give you an example, the insurance community. So if a company receives benefit from doing the right thing and getting an insurance benefit from it as well, that's a pretty good incentive. But the bigger picture is what we are looking for, and once again, narrowly crafted to core critical infrastructure. These are things that businesses should be doing anyway. Electrical companies don't get paid unless that meter is spinning or the numbers are spinning in the day of smart grid. So as a consequence, there's a business reason to do it. So the cost should not be something where the government's imposing some cost on us. The second piece is what we have proposed is says not create some new regulatory schema that now you have to do 15 reports to 15 different government agencies. If you already have a responsibility report, we just need to make sure that DHS has the visibility into that so they can have a level of assurance that you're doing what you need to do. That's the thing we're working on.
And it's only fair to report one other concern that I've heard from the cybersecurity expert side of things is that some of that lobbying has resulted in exemptions in the Senate bill in particular. Is that a concern for the White House right now in terms of raising the bar too high for the regulations?
Well, I think when we start looking at any exemptions that are out there now, hopefully that will be reconciled as the bill moves forward. But clearly, narrowly crafting core critical infrastructure may indeed have some exemptions to it, so we can just continue with business and get that done, whereas we're still supporting that narrow piece that we need to keep those other industries running and alive.
Howard Schmidt, you probably saw this, but I want to get your reaction to Speaker Boehner's quote in the New York Times. The White House believes the government ought to control the internet, government ought to set standards, and government ought to take care of everything that's needed for cybersecurity. They're in a camp all by themselves.
Yeah, and I couldn't disagree with that more. I mean, it's quite the opposite. The government, the administration specifically, has worked very hard to make sure that internet governance, for example, is a multi-stakeholder international piece. We're not looking to go out and say, here's a government standard you have to adhere to. There is ISO, International Standards Organization, 27000 series. There's NIST standards that private sector has helped build. Private sector has helped put forward a lot of these, so that couldn't be further from the truth. What we're trying to do is make sure that it's available to everybody by making sure we're having a collaborative, multi-stakeholder effort to secure cyberspace.
Now, you've talked about narrowly crafted to national concerns. Right. Who's left out of that?
And for example, you mentioned a few minutes ago about different businesses and things that are not core to power generation in large metropolitan areas, for example, things that affect our ability to have potable water, keep airplanes flying on schedule and things like that. Those are the pieces that we have to look at. Once again, the legislation looks to have a dialogue with private sector to identify and define a process on how do we actually define what business process, what company, or what sector has got to be part of this.
Some have described the current cybersecurity legislation, particularly the one in the Senate, as kind of a Patriot Act, and that there's some privacy concerns here and some freedom concerns. How do you address those?
Yeah, and that couldn't be farther from the truth again. I mean, we were very, very deliberate in putting privacy protections in there at all levels, including oversight, making sure that we have independent bodies like the President's Civil Liberties Oversight Board, making sure that they are part of this process. So it's been very, very, it's been a lot of work and a very, very deliberate effort to make sure those things that you mentioned don't occur in this bill.
This is the Communicators, C-SPAN's weekly look at telecommunications legislation and policy. This week, our guest is Howard Schmidt, who is the White House Cybersecurity Coordinator and Special Assistant to the President. Gautam Nagesh is the editor of Congressional Quarterly's technology executive briefing, and he's our guest reporter.
Thank you. Now, one of the tensions about implementing this cybersecurity plan that the White House and the Senate proposed is who should be in charge. And we've seen the Democrats in the White House come largely down on the side of the Department of Homeland Security as a civilian agency. However, we've heard from Republicans and some other national security stakeholders that they would like to see the intelligence community, NSA, have a more active role. The White House has been very strong that it should be a civilian enterprise. Can you explain why that is?
Sure. Yeah, I think there's two pieces. This is an all-government effort, and that's ever since my office was established, that's the viewpoint that we've had. The intelligence community, the Department of Defense, has tremendous capabilities they built up over the years. They were one of the early adopters when it came to moving networks into an IP-based environment, the internet environment that we live in today. So the expertise exists. We fully recognize that the law enforcement community, the FBI, Secret Service, Department of Justice has an investigative role and in some cases a counterintelligence role. But Department of Homeland Security, by congressional law as well as presidential directives, have said that you are the body that works with private sector to help protect critical infrastructure, as well as there's the belief on the FISMA implementation for the .gov environment as well. So it's in law. We support that. We think that gives us the best ability to leverage all the other components of government, but clearly have the responsibility with the Department of Homeland Security. And I also like to add the Department of Homeland Security over the past years have not only had tremendous leadership from the Secretary, the Deputy Secretary, a number of undersecretaries, but also has recruited and retained some tremendous talent that really understands this area, that comes from private sector, that comes from a background that says, yeah, this is not all about the government, this is how we can work together to solve these problems.
You actually spoke directly to my next question, which is, we have seen the DHS hire a rash of new cybersecurity officials in recent months, but do they have the level of expertise necessary, especially when you consider that they're competing with the Pentagon, the intelligence community, and the private sector for skills that are in high demand?
And it used to be a discussion I used to have with some of the industry experts, my colleagues I used to work with all the time, that would say, yeah, I'd thought about going to DHS, but I'm not quite sure they're ready for somebody at my level. And my response has always been, if you think they're not ready, by you going there would help prepare them better. And I think that's what we've seen. The talent we've got that came over, the person that really implemented continuous monitoring of the State Department is now over there. We brought someone that was with the energy sector, ran the cybersecurity for a couple states. We have the talent there. And granted, it's very competitive, which is part of our legislation is looking to give DHS the ability to become more competitive pay-wise with not only private sector, but other government agencies.
What do you think of John McCain's approach? No mandates, but protecting infrastructure, according to him.
Yeah, and that's the challenge we have. The idea of somebody saying, well, I'll do what I'm supposed to do, but don't ask me to prove that I'm doing it, that's a challenge. I think once again, we ask more as a country. And coming from a private sector background and a background with venture capitalists and folks that work in that area, we always ask somebody to say, yes, if you're going to ask me to invest in you, which is effectively what we're doing as a nation, that you have to give me some sort of level of assurance that you're really going to deliver on these things I'm investing in. We as a government have a responsibility to help foster that.
Is there a size of a business that you would say, nah, we don't care about that 10-person company, or not that we don't care, but right. we're not going to make them report to the Department of Homeland Security as well?
Absolutely correct. And that's where, and I keep using the term the core critical infrastructure, the things that affect major metropolitan areas or affect health and safety in certain areas. So the small company that's doing great business, helping on e-commerce, there's no intent nor desire for them to interfere with them. On the same token, through other efforts within the executive branch, making sure that they have visibility in some of the threats that may be out there through FTC, through Department of Commerce and Department of Homeland Security. So they've got the information. So we care about them, but they're not part of this discussion.
But that goes back then to the Sony question. Why is should Sony be part of this core critical infrastructure?
Yeah, and I'm not sure anyone has suggested Sony would. The question is the events that took place at Sony were of such a magnitude we could see them in other more critical areas, and that's the part that we need to focus on. Not that Sony itself would be part of it, but the fact that we see what happened and can see it happening in other places as well.
Is there, and do you foresee a role for the Pentagon or for the National Security Agency?
Absolutely, and that's when we talk about the all-of-government approach in this. The expertise that's been built up over in the intelligence community and Department of Defense, no one wants to duplicate or even try to duplicate because the expertise exists there. But to make sure the Department of Homeland Security has the ability to leverage that as far as fulfilling their mission.
Gautam Nagesh.
Now, you've mentioned the threat to companies, but one of the threats most cited is the advanced persistent threat from other nations. We've talked about how to secure our networks. What about when does the U.S. feel it's necessary to respond? And can you talk about the policy in that area, which Congress has asked the administration, the Pentagon, to clarify?
And so when we released the President's International Strategy for Cyberspace last year, it was sort of the first document that sort of brought all these things together, from the prosperity, the economic openness, the defense, the law enforcement capabilities in one document. So when we start looking at, as referred to as APT, or Advanced Persistent Threat, and a couple quick pieces on that. While we use the term often advanced, oftentimes the successful rates of getting into some of these systems is not advanced. It's using spear phishing emails, pieces of malware that are disguised as your 2012 pay raise documents and things of that. So that's not very advanced. That's just hacking 101. The persistence is very much the case, and the fact it's a threat. So one of the things we need to do, we know the vulnerabilities exist. Every expert within the government and outside of government said about 85% of the successful intrusions into systems by presumably nation states could have been prevented from basic cyber hygiene. And we like to reduce that. That means we can focus on that top 15%, the most insidious and also the most damaging to the country. Then that gives us the ability to follow up with a policy. The president has the ability in his role of commander-in-chief to designate under any national emergency the tools and resources necessary to help mitigate that.
At what point, in your view as an advisor to the president, does an attack from a foreign country on our nation's infrastructure constitute an act of war?
Well, I'm not a lawyer, and we want to make sure we're very clear on that. And we have to look at the totality of the circumstances. As we said in the international strategy, there's a whole myriad of things with any conflict that would have, from a diplomatic to an economic to a military response, and all those things have to be part of a discussion based around a specific scenario that may or may not occur in the future.
Mr. Schmidt, are you seeing evidence that nation states are actively promoting the use of cyber attacks?
It's interesting because oftentimes we see an awful lot of nation states talk about the threats that are out there, their military response, their national security response. So there's a lot of discussion about that, which comes back to part of the international strategy is how do we establish those norms in cyberspace? What are the things that we as nations agree are things that are off the table under the normal day-to-day operations? So we see a lot out there, we read a lot about it, but the focus is how do we sort of de-escalate those things is to don't affect the way the world interacts in a very, very positive respect with the internet and save the really, really dramatic things for the worst case scenarios.
Because we often read about the Chinese or the North Koreans. What does that mean?
Well, and it's interesting because there's intelligence reports that basically accumulate things from their perspective. There's companies, individuals that write on things. But once again, we can't focus on just one piece of it. We're looking for a partnership with the international community, including those that are competitive with us, to say, how can we bring this down a notch to make sure that we're not putting our countries, our economies, and our citizens at risk because of all this rhetoric that goes back and forth.
Cyber attacks is also a tool that the U.S. could use militarily if it chose to, right?
And we've called that out. The laws of armed conflict we think apply in cyberspace just like they do in the real world. Human rights doctrine that apply in cyberspace. So these are all the things that our strategy laid out that says here's all the options that are available as nation states.
Do you have a paragraph or two in the President's daily intelligence report that he gets about cyber attacks on the U.S.?
Yeah, and the President's daily reports are based on products that the intelligence community based on a lot of situations. So I wouldn't say that there's any specific thing that's there on a daily basis, but clearly when cyber issues rise to that level, the President would be briefed on it.
If we identified your job as having three constituencies, the President, the Congress, and the American people, at what level do you have their attention at this point on cybersecurity?
Boy, I think at a high level in all respects. I mean, the President cares very deeply about it. When he established this office, he's very much engaged. His State of the Union speech, he also addressed the issue specifically around cyber threats and cyber legislation. Legislative branch, as I mentioned earlier, We've seen tremendous bipartisanship in the past with national security and public safety issues, so we have a lot of attention there. The industry community has really come forth and said, not only do we understand the threat, but here's the things that we're doing. We have an industry botnet group that's taking place. We have a lot of efforts that are taking place out there, and I'd also sort of throw in the broader, more than the president, is the entire executive branch, because the .gov environment is part that the secretaries and deputy secretaries very much a part of their agenda on a regular basis.
Gautam Nagesh.
Absent a compromise on critical infrastructure, do you anticipate some of these other measures from the House addressing cybersecurity issues like FISMA reform or research and development in a piecemeal fashion? Is that something that the White House would be receptive to, or did they insist on seeing a comprehensive package like the Senate bill go through?
Well, we put a lot of effort into taking all these ideas that across the government and private sector and culling them down to say, here's the specific things that we need Congress to do, which is why we support Lieberman, Collins, Rockefeller, and Feinstein bill, is because that brings all these things together. And a piecemeal is going part way, and we can't afford as a country to go part way. This has been a lot of discussion since 2003, when we released the 2003 National Strategy to Secure Cyberspace. It's time to act on it, and that's why we need to have these all come together at one point.
So would no bill at all becoming law this year be a better situation than some of the House legislation passing?
We'd like to hope we won't be faced with that. We hope that cooler heads will prevail. We'll see the national security implications. Everybody come together and says, here's the small pieces we need. Let's get them in and get them moved forward.
Howard Schmidt, on an international level, what's a country that we could look at and maybe see as a model of cybersecurity?
Well, it's interesting because many countries are facing the same things we are. Owned and operated by the private sector for critical infrastructure. Government have a tremendous dependency on it. Developing strategies. We've seen probably a half a dozen national strategies come out from Canada, the UK, Australia in the past months. We have German government. We have a really good relationship building, confidence building measures with the Russian government. So there's a lot going on in the international world, and I think we're starting at different places, but we continuously dialogue with each other to help shore up each other to make sure people don't have to reinvent the wheel from other countries.
And Gautam Nagesh, we have time for one more question.
I think international is a good place to close. How large a priority has cybersecurity and intellectual property enforcement become in trade talks when the U.S. is engaged with our partners? Obviously, we're speaking to some of these countries that are accused of attacking our networks every day. Does that come up?
It does come up, and that's part of the things when we look at sort of the all-government approach, mention the diplomatic, the economic, the trade issues. Every facet of the dialogue the executive branch is having with our international partners, whether it's a strategic economic dialogue or security dialogue, these are part of the agenda and increasingly being even a higher position point within those dialogues.
You've been watching the Communicators. Howard Schmidt has been our guest, White House Cybersecurity Coordinator, along with Gautam Nagesh, an editor at Congressional Quarterly. Gentlemen, thank you.
Thank you.